A police officer stops a suspicious man, but everything changes when he sees a little girl with a terrified look in the back seat. What seemed like a simple kidnapping case unfolds into an even darker nightmare. The evening sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm amber glow over the streets of the city. The crisp air, tinged with the scent of gasoline and fried street food from nearby vendors, mixed with the faint, ever-present smell of rain, though the clouds remained distant, threatening to unleash their fury later. Officer James Sullivan stood at the side of his patrol car, his boots clicking on the cracked pavement as he adjusted his hat and checked the rearview mirror. His eyes were sharp, scanning the road ahead with the vigilance of a seasoned officer. It had been a slow evening so far, but he knew better than to get complacent. One mistake, one moment of distraction, and everything could change. A car appeared in his line of sight, a rusty sedan, weaving slightly in and out of its lane, its tires squealing as the driver accelerated, clearly in a hurry. Sullivan's instincts went on high alert. This wasn't just a careless driver, something about it felt off. The car swerved again, nearly clipping a parked truck on the side of the road. James didn't hesitate. He flicked on the siren, the sharp sound cutting through the hum of the city. The sedan veered to the side, slowing down, and pulled over to the shoulder. James sighed as he parked his cruiser behind it, his fingers instinctively running over the keys of his radio. He was used to these routine stops, but something told him that tonight wouldn't be the same. As he approached the car, the smell of stale air and cheap cologne assaulted his senses. The windows were rolled halfway down, and through the thick haze, James could make out a man hunched over the steering wheel, his face obscured by the rearview mirror. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, and his body language was tense. There was something about him that felt anxious, as though he were hiding something. James couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he had seen enough to trust his gut. He knocked on the window. "License and registration," he ordered, his voice firm. The man inside flinched at the sound, his eyes flickering nervously before slowly reaching for the glove compartment. As he did so, a soft, trembling voice came from the back seat. It was high-pitched and fragile, cutting through the tension in the air. The words seemed to float in the cool evening breeze, like an echo in the quiet night. "He's not my dad." James froze. He hadn't expected that. His hand, still hovering near his holster, stilled as his mind raced. The girl's words were like a slap to the face. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the girl in the back seat. She couldn't have been older than 6, her small frame barely visible behind the dirty seat. She was staring out of the window, her face pale and drawn, her expression one of quiet fear. The man in the driver's seat stiffened, his hand pausing mid-air as he reached for the glove compartment. He quickly looked back at James, his eyes wide, avoiding any direct eye contact. "Sir," James began, his voice low but firm, "what's going on back there? Who's in the back seat?" The man swallowed hard, his lips pressing into a thin line. His fingers twitched nervously. "She's just a kid, officer." "You got no reason to," he began, but his voice trailed off as James took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "I asked you a question," James repeated, his voice sharpening. "Who's in the back seat, and why are you acting so nervous?" The man shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under James's piercing gaze. She's just my niece," he stammered, trying to smile, but the effort came across as forced. The lie was thin, easily detectable. But James wasn't ready to let it go. Something wasn't right, and his instincts screamed at him to dig deeper. James's gaze flicked back to the little girl. She was gripping her seatbelt tightly, her knuckles white. Her face, once soft with innocence, now looked hardened, the traces of a deep, unspoken fear hiding behind her wide, frightened eyes. There was something unsettling in the way she looked at him. It wasn't just the fear of a child caught in a stranger's vehicle, it was something darker. Something that said this child had been through more than a simple traffic stop could explain. The girl spoke again, her voice a soft whisper. "He's not my dad," she repeated, this time louder, more certain. She turned her gaze toward James, locking eyes with him for a brief moment. There was something there in her eyes, something that made James's chest tighten. She wasn't just scared, she was pleading for help. His heart rate quickened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the realization sinking in like a stone. This wasn't a simple traffic stop. This was a crisis. This child was not in a safe place. His hand instinctively went to his radio, his fingers flying over the buttons. "I need backup," he muttered under his breath, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "Possible abduction in progress. Send units to my location, now." The man in the driver's seat began to panic, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, then to the door, then back to James. He was calculating, trying to decide his next move, but James could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the tremor in his hands. He knew the man was lying. The girl's words had confirmed it. "I told you, she's my niece." "You don't need to do this," the man pleaded, his voice breaking as he fumbled with the door handle, clearly considering making a run for it. But James wasn't going to let him get away. "Step out of the car," James ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Now." The man hesitated for a moment before jerking open the door, stepping out with his hands raised in surrender. James kept his hand close to his holster, his eyes never leaving the man's shaky form. "Stay where you are," James commanded. "I'll deal with you in a second. But right now, I need to make sure that little girl is okay." He walked around to the back of the car, his mind racing. The air felt heavier now, suffused with the sense that everything had just shifted. He knelt down to the little girl's level, his voice gentle, as if trying to calm her fragile spirit. "Hey, it's okay," James said softly. "Can you tell me your name? Where are your parents?" Her eyes widened even more, her breath shallow. She looked like she was on the verge of tears, but she held them back. "My name is Lily," she whispered, her voice quivering. My mommy is at home. She told me not to talk to strangers. But, he's not my daddy. He took me." James felt a pang of heartbreak shoot through him as Lily's words sank in. She wasn't just a lost child, she was a victim. This man had taken her, and the pain of that knowledge gnawed at his very core. "Don't worry, Lily. You're safe now. We're going to get you home," James reassured her, his voice steady even though his insides were twisted in knots. The man was starting to squirm, his foot tapping nervously on the ground. But James's focus was entirely on Lily. He needed to make sure she was okay, needed to find out where she belonged. He had to get to the bottom of this, and fast. He wouldn't let this child fall through the cracks. As James turned his attention back to the man, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was unfolding, something that would change everything. James Sullivan's heart beat heavily in his chest, his mind racing as he kneeled down next to Lily, trying to make sense of the situation. Her tiny frame, trembling in the back seat, had a look in her eyes that was all too familiar, fear, confusion, and a hint of hopelessness. He needed to get to the bottom of this fast. The man who had been driving, now standing outside the car, shifted nervously from one foot to the other, his hands still raised in the air as if trying to stay out of trouble, but there was no mistaking the panic in his movements. James looked back at the man, his gaze cold. "Listen, buddy. We're going to figure this out, but I need you to calm down and tell me the truth. Who are you, and where did you get this little girl?" The man swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously, and he hesitated before responding, clearly trying to gather his thoughts. I already told you, officer, she's my niece. Her parents, they're out of town, and they asked me to look after her, he stammered, his voice too high-pitched, too defensive. James wasn't buying it. There was something about the man's words that didn't sit right with him. Lily, who had been silent for a moment, suddenly spoke again, her voice quivering but clear. He's lying. Her words hit James like a cold gust of wind. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her small hands clutching the seatbelt tightly, her knuckles turning white. He's not my uncle. He's not my dad. I want to go home. James could feel the knot tightening in his stomach. The panic in the girl's voice sent a wave of anger through him, but he kept his composure. His gaze flickered back to the man, whose face had gone pale. He was sweating now, beads of perspiration running down his forehead despite the cool evening air. James could see the lie unraveling in front of him, piece by piece. I don't know what you're talking about, officer, the man said, his voice shaking, but James could tell he was trying to hold on to whatever story he had constructed. I'm just trying to get her to safety. You don't know what it's like out there. I didn't have a choice. James's patience wore thin. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This man had taken Lily from somewhere, someone who was probably frantic by now, trying to figure out where she was. Taking a step forward, James pulled out his phone and dialed the department's child protection unit, not taking his eyes off the man for even a second. I need a welfare check on a little girl, possibly abducted. I've got a man here who claims she's his niece, but she's saying otherwise. The dispatcher on the other end of the line was quick to respond, but James wasn't listening to the words, they were background noise as he studied the man. Every twitch, every shift in his body language, only made the officer more certain. This man wasn't telling the truth. How old is she? James heard the dispatcher ask, her voice sharp. She's about 6, James replied, his eyes moving from the man back to Lily. Her face, so full of fear, made the situation even more urgent. She's scared. She says he's not her father or uncle. He's hiding something. As the dispatcher confirmed that a unit was on its way, James knew he couldn't wait around. He had to take control of the situation. He pulled out his handcuffs, a quiet, metal click cutting through the tense atmosphere. Turn around, sir, he ordered, his voice firm but steady. The man immediately started to protest, but it was weak, his words faltering. You don't have to do this. I didn't do anything wrong, he mumbled, but his voice was trembling now, his fear much more apparent than before. James didn't listen to the man's excuses. With a practiced motion, he snapped the cuffs around his wrists, the cold metal biting into the man's skin. The sight of the cuffs seemed to send a wave of panic over him, but he didn't try to fight it. He couldn't. He was caught. James wasn't about to let him go until he figured out exactly what had been going on. Now, let's talk, James said, his voice low. You're coming with me. We're going to figure this out. The man remained silent, and James led him to the back of his patrol car, forcing him to sit in the back. He couldn't help but notice that the man seemed almost relieved. It was as if the weight of the situation had finally sunk in, and now there was nowhere for him to run. But as James walked back to the sedan, his mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Where had he taken Lily from? And what was his connection to her? Turning back to the car, James knelt down again, looking inside at Lily. She was still in her seat, eyes wide, clutching the seatbelt as if it were her only lifeline. Her little body was trembling, her bottom lip quivering with suppressed tears. James softened his voice. Lily, he said gently, I need you to tell me something. Can you tell me where you were before you got in this car? Do you know who took you? Lily looked at him with big, brown eyes, her gaze filled with silent desperation. Her lip trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was at my friend's house, she said, her words rushed, as though she were afraid to speak. My mommy, she was supposed to come get me, but then he came. He said I had to go with him. That mommy was too busy. James felt a lump form in his throat, his heart aching for this little girl. The man had lied. It wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, it was something far more sinister. He had taken Lily, not because of some family emergency, but for some other, darker reason. Did you know him before? James asked, already guessing the answer. Lily shook her head, her small voice breaking. No. He just said his name was Mr. Jason. I didn't want to go with him, but he said he was going to take me somewhere nice. She wiped her eyes, her little hand trembling as she did. I want to go home. I want mommy. James swallowed the anger rising in his chest. Jason had lured this innocent girl away from her home, from her mother, with lies and promises. And now, it was clear, he wasn't just an uncle. He wasn't even a distant relative. This was a case of abduction, of a little girl stolen from her family. James stood up, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the man in the back of the patrol car. You're going to answer for this, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. With Lily safe and her story starting to take shape, James knew one thing for sure, this case wasn't going to be over anytime soon. But as he glanced at the girl once more, he promised her, silently, that he would make sure she got back to her family. She was going to be okay. But what James didn't know yet, was that this wasn't just an abduction. The truth was far more complicated, and much more dangerous. James Sullivan stood over the sedan, his mind whirling as he processed what little Lily had told him. He had always known there was more to a story than what it seemed, but he hadn't expected this, an innocent child being abducted by someone she didn't even know. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make sense yet. Not entirely. Lily was safe, but what about the truth behind this man, Jason, the one she had called Mr. Jason? Who was he, really? What had he been trying to hide? As James walked back to the patrol car, he glanced at Lily once more. The little girl was visibly calmer now, her breathing steadying, but the traces of fear lingered in her eyes. She had already been through too much. He needed to make sure this man, this Jason, didn't get away with whatever he was planning. He opened the door of the cruiser and slid into the driver's seat. The man, Jason, was still sitting there, his hands cuffed behind his back, slumped forward, his eyes staring vacantly at the floor. He hadn't said a word since James had placed him in the back of the car, and that silence was only adding to the tension. James glanced at the rearview mirror and caught Jason's reflection. He had to break the man. He had to get him to talk. Time was critical. The backup unit wasn't due for at least another 10 minutes, and James knew better than to wait around. His fingers curled around the steering wheel as his thoughts raced. Jason, he said, his voice steady but tinged with a growing anger. I know you're not just some uncle looking out for his niece. And I know you're lying about everything. So here's the deal. You start talking now, or things are going to get a lot worse for you. Jason's eyes flickered briefly to James's face, but he didn't respond. His lips were pressed tightly together, his face pale, almost clammy under the faint glow of the cruiser's interior light. James slammed his fist against the dashboard, the sound ringing in the silence of the car. I don't have time for this, he muttered. You took her. And I'm not leaving until I get the full story. If she's telling the truth, and you did something to her. Jason's head jerked up suddenly, his eyes wide with panic. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he muttered, I didn't mean to hurt her. I just needed her. James's breath caught in his chest. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Needed her for what?" Jason shook his head as if trying to erase his words, his body jerking slightly. He looked out the window, avoiding James's gaze. The officer could almost hear the man's internal struggle as he hesitated, clearly debating whether to say more. Lily's face flashed in James's mind, the raw fear in her eyes, the desperate way she had clung to that seatbelt. James took a deep breath, keeping his voice as calm as possible. "You're going to tell me everything. Every single thing, and you're going to do it now." Jason's lip quivered, and then he slumped in his seat, his shoulders deflating like a balloon. Finally, his voice cracked, and the truth started to spill out. He hesitated again. "I didn't want to do this. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Jason's voice trembled as he spoke. "But she's the only way I could get what I wanted. I wasn't going to hurt her. I swear." James's eyes narrowed. "What you wanted? What are you talking about, man?" Jason looked at him then, his face twisted in desperation. "I lost everything, officer. My job. My house. My life. I was drowning in debt. There was no way out, nothing left for me. Then I found out about Lily. I knew her mother, kind of, she used to work with me. She doesn't know me, though. She doesn't even know I exist." His eyes shone with a mixture of guilt and shame. "But I knew her. I knew about Lily. And I thought if I could take her, I could get some leverage. I thought maybe her mom would give me money or something to get her back." James's chest tightened as Jason's words sank in. It wasn't just an abduction, it was a desperate, twisted scheme, driven by the man's financial ruin and distorted sense of hope. The idea that Jason believed kidnapping an innocent girl could solve his problems was unfathomable. Lily wasn't just a pawn. She was a victim, someone who had been caught in the crossfire of a man's desperate, delusional thinking. And now, she was more than just an innocent child caught in the middle, she was his bargaining chip. "But when I saw her," Jason continued, his voice breaking, "I couldn't do it. I couldn't hurt her. She's just a little girl. I thought maybe I could keep her safe until I figured something out. But I was scared she'd tell someone. I thought maybe I could convince her mom to help me before anyone found out. But I couldn't. I was so scared." James listened in grim silence, his mind spinning with the sheer audacity and twisted logic behind Jason's words. He had taken Lily, not because he was her family, not because he cared for her, but because he was grasping at any shred of hope to fix his own shattered life. In doing so, he had subjected an innocent child to his own selfish, misguided motives. "And you thought you could just keep her locked up here?" James asked, his voice low with disbelief. "What were you planning to do with her, Jason? Hold her hostage?" Jason's face was a portrait of guilt and confusion. "No, I didn't mean to. I just thought I could keep her calm, keep her safe, until I figured out a way to make things right." James shook his head. "You're lucky she's not hurt. But you'll never get away with this." His hand reached for the radio again. "Dispatch, I need a unit here immediately. This man has just confessed to abducting a child. I need immediate backup to transport him." Jason's body tensed at the mention of backup. "Wait, no, please. You don't understand. Please, I didn't mean it." His voice was frantic now, pleading. James didn't listen to his desperate words. He wasn't going to fall for this. This was over. As Jason was removed from the car and led away by backup officers, James's mind kept circling back to one question: what had he done to make someone like Jason feel so desperate that this was his only option? It was a dangerous path to go down, but James had seen how quickly desperation could turn into something much darker. And as Lily's face filled his thoughts, he promised himself one thing: this man would never get the chance to hurt anyone again. But the shocking truth was, Jason wasn't the only one involved in this web. There was someone else, someone even closer to Lily, who had a much darker hand in her fate. The pieces were just beginning to fit together, and James had no idea how deep the rabbit hole really went. The ride to the station was quiet, save for the soft hum of the patrol car's engine and the distant sound of sirens in the background. James sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he replayed everything that had just transpired. Jason's confession, how he had taken Lily, hoping for some kind of ransom, but faltering when confronted with her innocence, was only part of the story. The officer's mind churned with questions that refused to settle. Why had Jason been so desperate? What was behind this madness? It didn't add up, and it gnawed at James like a persistent itch that refused to be scratched. Lily, still in the back seat, had grown quiet again. Her small body was curled up against the door, her legs tucked beneath her, eyes vacant as she stared out the window. The sound of her sniffles was faint, but it tugged at James's heartstrings. No child should have to go through this. He glanced in the rearview mirror at her. "You okay back there, kiddo?" Lily's eyes met his for a brief moment before she nodded. "I just want to go home," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James gave a small, reassuring smile. "I know. And we're going to get you there, I promise. But I need to ask you a few more things, okay?" Lily didn't respond at first. Her eyes shifted toward the window again, her mind clearly still processing everything that had happened. After a long pause, she turned back to James, her small lips trembling. "I'm scared," she said, her voice breaking. James's heart tightened. This wasn't just some random abduction. There was something far more complicated at play here, something far darker. "You're safe now," James said, his tone gentle yet firm. "But I need you to be honest with me. Do you know why Jason, Mr. Jason, took you? Was there anyone else involved? Anyone who knew about it?" Lily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't know," she said hesitantly, her gaze flickering between her lap and the window. "But I remember something. It's fuzzy, but I remember my mommy talking about a man named Derek. He used to work with her. She said something about him being dangerous, and she was scared of him." James felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of the name. Derek. Why did that sound so familiar? He had heard it before, somewhere, when he was investigating the initial stages of the case. The connection between the name and Jason started to form a picture in his mind, one that made his pulse quicken. Derek wasn't just a name in the background. He had been involved in something that tied him to Jason. His instincts screamed at him to keep pressing Lily, to dig deeper, but he had to tread carefully. This was no longer just a simple case of abduction, it was beginning to look like a much more complicated web of lies, manipulation, and possibly even criminal ties. "Did your mom ever tell you anything else about Derek?" James asked, his voice calm but urgent. Lily shook her head, tears threatening to spill over once again. "No. She just said he was bad. She told me never to talk to him, that I'd be in danger if I did. And that's why I didn't want to go with Mr. Jason. I didn't know who he was, but he scared me. He kept saying everything would be okay, but I didn't believe him." James's mind raced as he processed her words. Derek was connected to this somehow. But how? The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a random kidnapping. Lily's mother, Claire, had known something was wrong long before Jason had shown up at her doorstep. "Lily," James began carefully, "I need you to think really hard. Was there ever a time when your mom talked to you about Derek and Jason? Did she ever mention them together? Lily's brow furrowed as she tried to recall, her face scrunching in concentration. Then, her eyes widened in realization. Oh! Wait, she bit her lip, clearly unsure of what she was about to say. I remember my mommy saying that Jason wasn't who he said he was. She said he was someone else, someone from her past. James's mind snapped to attention. Someone from her past. He had suspected something all along, but now it was becoming undeniable. Jason wasn't just a random guy in trouble. He had known Claire. He had known Lily's mother, and from the way Lily was speaking, he had probably been hiding his true identity this entire time. I think he was trying to get back at her for something, Lily added, her voice growing more uncertain. I don't know what, but I heard her crying once. She said she was afraid of him. But, she never told me why. James's mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. Derek, Jason, and Claire. There was a tangled history here, one that hadn't been fully uncovered yet. The feeling in James's gut told him that this wasn't just a simple criminal act, it was personal. It was revenge, and it had been brewing for a long time. We're almost there, kiddo, James said softly, trying to ground himself as the flashing lights of the station came into view. His heart was heavy, but his determination was unwavering. The truth was coming out, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. But as he pulled into the parking lot, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out quickly, his eyes scanning the message from dispatch. James, the text read, you need to look into Derek. We've got a major connection to Jason. He's a wanted man. Don't let him out of your sight. His stomach dropped. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. The web had grown larger, and it had spread far beyond what James could have ever imagined. Derek was part of something bigger. Something dangerous. And now, it was all about to come crashing down. The truth was closer than ever, but what he didn't know was that the real twist was waiting right under his nose. James's heart raced as he read the text from dispatch, his mind working to process the new information. Derek was a wanted man, that much was clear, but it didn't explain the full picture. He knew, deep down, that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than just a kidnapping case. The names, the connections, the lies, they all pointed to something far more sinister. As the cruiser rolled into the station parking lot, James's mind was already running through the possibilities. He needed to get inside, call in backup, and figure out exactly what kind of mess he had gotten himself into. But Lily's voice, small and fragile in the back seat, interrupted his thoughts. Officer James, she said quietly, her eyes wide and serious, is Mr. Jason going to hurt anyone else? James turned to face her. Her innocent eyes were full of worry, and it broke his heart that this little girl had been dragged into such a dangerous situation. He forced a reassuring smile, though inside, a wave of guilt washed over him. No, Lily, he said softly, Mr. Jason won't hurt anyone else. I'm going to make sure of that. Lily nodded, but James could see the uncertainty still clinging to her. She had been through too much already, and it wasn't over. He knew it wasn't over. There were more questions than answers, and time was running out. He parked the patrol car near the station doors, and the officers inside began to file out, ready to assist in the next phase of the investigation. James stepped out of the car, his thoughts spinning. He was close. He could feel it. The truth was right there, waiting to be uncovered, but he had to dig deeper. He needed more information about Jason, about Derek, and about Claire, Lily's mother. As he led Lily into the building, she clutched his hand tightly. The weight of her tiny fingers in his palm was a stark reminder of how fragile she was. He wanted to shield her from this nightmare, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Inside the station, James called for a detective to come down to help with the interrogation of Jason. He was already plotting his next move when the phone on his desk buzzed. The message was from his partner, Officer Lisa Green. "James, we found something. It's about Derek." His pulse quickened. This was it. This was the break he had been waiting for. "Tell me everything," he replied, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed the message. The phone buzzed back within seconds. "Derek is Claire's ex-husband. He's also been involved in a series of unsolved cases. Kidnappings, extortion, things we thought were unrelated. But now we're seeing a pattern. Jason was working with Derek, or for him, possibly. And Claire, she's the key." James's mind reeled. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. Claire, Lily's mother, was at the center of this mess. But why? What had happened between her and Derek? Why had she been so terrified? He turned to the detective standing next to him, his voice urgent. "We need to speak to Claire. Now." They rushed to the interrogation room where Jason was being held. The man looked up as they entered, his face drawn, pale from the stress of his own admission. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and his eyes were bloodshot, as if he hadn't processed anything that had happened. "Jason," James said, his tone cold, "we need to talk about Derek." The mention of the name seemed to make Jason flinch. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "I don't know where he is," Jason muttered. "I don't know what he's planning. He told me to take her. That's all I know. He was supposed to meet me at a warehouse, but I couldn't." James's eyes narrowed. A warehouse? That was the lead he needed. But Jason wasn't the one James needed to focus on right now. "Do you know where Claire is?" James asked, pressing him harder. Jason's eyes flickered with something that almost looked like fear. She's in trouble. Derek's been coming after her for years. He wanted to punish her. I don't know why, she never told me anything about it." James's blood ran cold. It was worse than he had feared. Derek hadn't just been using Jason for his own twisted agenda, he had been targeting Claire all along. But why? What had happened between them? And how did Lily fit into all of this? The door to the interrogation room swung open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, holding up a file. "James, you need to see this," the officer said, his face grim. "It's about Derek." James quickly took the file and opened it. His eyes scanned the pages, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw the photo. The man in the image was unmistakable. It was Derek, only now, James realized, he had seen him before. He had seen him in Claire's file. The connection was finally made. Derek had been more than just a criminal mastermind. He was Claire's ex-husband, a man she had left behind long ago, someone who had become obsessed with her. He had kept tabs on her, on Lily, for years. And now, he had Jason doing his bidding. The kidnapping, the threats, it had all been part of Derek's plan to get revenge on Claire. "Where is he?" James demanded. "We don't know," the officer replied, "but we have a lead. We believe he's at a location near the docks. We're going in." James's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The final confrontation was near. But what would he find at the docks? Was Derek waiting, ready to strike again? And if he was, would James be able to stop him in time? As the team prepped for the raid, James felt the weight of the situation press down on him. But nothing could prepare him for what was about to happen next. The truth wasn't just dark, it was a nightmare. James's hands gripped the wheel as the squad cars sped toward the docks, the urgency of the situation pressing down on him like a heavy weight. His thoughts were a blur, a mix of adrenaline and confusion. He had just learned the truth. Derek wasn't just some random criminal, he was Claire's ex-husband, a man with a vendetta, someone who had spent years scheming in the shadows. And Jason? Jason had been a pawn in Derek's twisted game. But there was something more James wasn't prepared for, something that would change everything. The air grew colder as they neared the docks. The sky above had turned a dull gray, the clouds thickening as if mirroring the stone building inside James. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, checking on Lily. She was still sitting quietly in the back seat, her small body huddled against the door. She had barely spoken since they'd left the station, her expression distant. It was as though the weight of everything, her kidnapping, the uncertainty, the fear, had finally settled in. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He quickly grabbed it, his heart leaping when he saw the text from Officer Lisa Green. "We found Claire. She's alive, but Derek's here too. We've got him cornered. Be ready." James's pulse quickened. This is it. This is where it ends. He shoved his phone back into his pocket and slammed the gas pedal, speeding through the winding roads that led to the docks. His breath caught in his throat as the first of the patrol cars turned onto the derelict street, their lights flashing in the heavy fog. The squad pulled into position, and James immediately jumped out of his car, motioning for the officers to follow. They crouched low, moving quickly toward the warehouse where Derek was believed to be holed up. Every step was heavy with anticipation. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and rust, the sound of waves crashing against the nearby piers breaking the silence. As they neared the entrance, James's mind raced. Where was Claire? Was Derek already gone? But the scene that unfolded before him made everything freeze. Standing at the entrance of the warehouse was Claire. She was alive, but barely. Her clothes were torn, and her face was pale and bruised. But the worst part wasn't her appearance, it was the look in her eyes. Desperation. Pain. But also, guilt. And standing next to her, his face twisted in a smug grin, was Derek. "Officer." Claire's voice broke through the tension, a cry of relief mingled with fear. "Get back. He's dangerous." Derek laughed, a low, menacing sound that echoed in the empty air. He held up his hands in mock surrender, his eyes flickering with a dangerous glint. "You think you've won, don't you, officer?" he taunted. This was never about kidnapping. It was about control. It was about punishing Claire for what she did to me. You see, she was never going to leave me. Not truly. She was mine, she still is. James's blood ran cold. The truth was beginning to take shape in the worst possible way. Derek's obsession with Claire had led to this, a vicious, twisted game of manipulation, one that had spiraled out of control. And now, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about something darker, something far more insidious. But there was something else. Something James hadn't expected, something that shattered the facade of the whole situation. Lily. From the shadows, she stepped forward, her tiny form emerging into the light. Her eyes were wide, and her small frame was trembling, but she didn't hesitate. Her voice, small but clear, pierced through the thick air. "He's not my dad," Lily said, her words carrying a weight that made Derek flinch. She stepped closer to Claire, who instinctively reached out for her, pulling her into a protective embrace. James's heart stopped as the revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. Lily wasn't Derek's child. All this time, Derek had been playing a twisted game, using Lily's existence as leverage, hoping to break Claire emotionally. But the truth was, Lily had no blood connection to him at all. She was Claire's child from a different relationship, one Derek had no claim to. For years, Derek had been playing the role of a father, manipulating the situation to make it seem like Lily was his, hoping to use her to hurt Claire. And all along, Lily had known the truth. She had been too afraid to speak it, but now, standing before him, she spoke with courage. Derek's eyes went wide with realization. For the first time, there was a crack in his carefully constructed mask. His smug expression faltered, and James could see the panic building in his eyes. His entire plan, his whole vendetta, had been based on a lie. Lily wasn't his daughter. She was Claire's, purely and simply. "You lying little," Derek started, but before he could finish, the officers moved in quickly, restraining him. His attempt to resist was futile, and soon enough, he was on the ground, cuffed and ready for transport. James turned to Claire, who had her arms wrapped tightly around Lily. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and guilt, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never wanted this to happen. Derek, he took everything from me. My peace, my sanity, my daughter. I just wanted to keep her safe." James gave a small nod, understanding the weight of her words. The truth was out now. Derek would be facing the consequences of his actions, and Claire could finally begin to rebuild her life, free from the fear and torment that had ruled it for so long. Lily looked up at James, her small face filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving us." James smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride. "You're safe now," he said. "That's all that matters." As they all stood there, the sound of sirens in the distance fading away, James couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The twisted story had come to an end. But what none of them could have predicted was the twist that had come from within Derek himself, a lie so carefully constructed that it had nearly destroyed them all. And now, as Derek was led away in handcuffs, James understood something more profound than ever before. Sometimes, the darkest lies are the ones we tell ourselves.